this past week, so as Craig noted, this past week we launched the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. And this was an effort by a team of scientists and philosophers and other experts of various kinds related to animal cognition and behavior, as well as ethics and policy. And the declaration, which you can all now find online at nydeclaration.com, again, nydeclaration.com. The declaration makes three simple claims. The first is that the evidence now strongly supports attributions of consciousness to mammals and birds. That part is not particularly surprising. The second is that the evidence also supports a realistic possibility of consciousness in all vertebrates, including reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, as well as many invertebrates, including cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like hermit crabs, and insects like bees and fruit flies, and many of the other insects with whom we interact at a very large scale. So those are striking empirical claims, a realistic possibility of consciousness in all vertebrates and many invertebrates. And then the third claim that the Declaration makes is more about ethics and policy. This claim is that when an individual has a realistic chance of being conscious, then we should consider welfare risks for that individual when deciding how to treat them. So a realistic chance of consciousness is sufficient for at least minimal moral considerability. So let me start by saying a little bit about what we mean by each of those three claims, and then we can start to unpack some of the potential ethical implications of a realistic possibility of consciousness in all of these animals, and particularly for our purposes today in insects. First of all, why do we speak in terms of a realistic possibility of consciousness for all vertebrates and many invertebrates? The reason is that consciousness is generally not a topic about which we can have certainty. We are not able to know for sure whether many animals are or are not capable of subjective experiences like pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering and hope and fear. We can see their external behaviors and physiological features, but we are not able to directly perceive whether they can have these private, subjective, qualitative experiences corresponding to those behaviors and physiological features. We cannot directly perceive whether it feels like something to be a bee or a fruit fly or other insects. So we are not able to have certainty, especially given the mixed and limited state of the evidence at present. But we can canvass leading scientific theories of consciousness for behavioral and physiological indicators of consciousness, external features that, when present, increase the probability that an individual is conscious, given the evidence available to us. So in the same kind of way that the symptoms of a disease make it more likely that you have the disease without proving that you have it, having certain behavioral or physiological indicators of consciousness make it more likely that you have subjective experiences, from my perspective, without proving that you have subjective experiences, from my perspective. And again, I can leave it to other speakers in this webinar series to tell you about all of the emerging evidence about insects in detail. But for present purposes today, suffice to say that while again, the evidence is still quite mixed and limited, in part due to our own past lack of curiosity about insect cognition and behavior, the more we look for evidence, the more we find, for many of us, very surprising evidence of sophisticated cognitive and behavioral capacities in insects. The more we find that many insect species have remarkable capacities for perception and learning and memory and anticipation and at least certain kinds of self-awareness and social awareness and communication and problem-solving abilities. And again, this might not decisively prove that it feels like something to be these insects and that they can feel pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering and hope and fear in anything like the way that we can. But When we find all of those capacities in insects, or even a decent number of them, it nudges the probability up. And our view as authors and signatories of the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness is that the current state of evidence, limited though it may be, is enough to warrant what we are calling a realistic possibility of consciousness in insects. There is a realistic chance that it feels like something to be them, and maybe even that they can have experiences that feel good or bad to them, like pleasure and pain. And then that leads us to the ethical and policy part of the Declaration, which is that when an individual has a realistic chance of being conscious, then we should consider welfare risks for that individual when making decisions that affect them, when deciding how to treat them, how to interact with them. And the reason for that is simply that risk and uncertainty matter for our actions and policies. I do not need to be certain that my action is going to harm someone in order to be required to consider the risk that my action might harm someone. So for example, why is driving drunk wrong? Driving drunk is not wrong because it definitely is going to harm and kill someone. It might not definitely harm and kill anyone. In fact, it might not even probably harm and kill anyone. The probability that driving drunk is going to harm and kill someone might be low. It might be 1 in 100 or even 1 in 1,000. But if driving drunk carries a 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 chance of harming or killing somebody against their will unnecessarily, then that at least merits consideration. And it might even, if I have alternative ways of getting home available to me, it might even be a sufficient reason to call a Lyft or call an Uber or call a friend or stay where I am and sober up. So even a low risk of harm can merit consideration. And in certain situations, when you have good alternatives available to you, for example, in certain situations, it can even be a decisive factor in your decision making. Now, all we are saying here is that when an animal has a realistic chance of being conscious, that means there is a realistic chance that some of our actions could be helpful or harmful to them. And that at least merits consideration when we are making decisions about how to treat that individual. Now, we might disagree about exactly how likely insects are to be conscious. We might disagree about exactly how much weight these welfare risks should carry in our deliberations, and we can talk about some of those issues later on. For present purposes, what the Declaration is claiming is simply that once an individual has a realistic chance of being conscious, then that individual and welfare risks for that individual, they merit at least minimal consideration. They should be at least a weak factor in our deliberations about what to do. And while signatories to the Declaration might disagree about many scientific matters and many ethical matters and many political matters, we do agree about at least that much, that all vertebrates and many invertebrates have a realistic chance of being conscious, and therefore we should consider welfare risks for those animals when deciding how to treat them. Now, that is a quite minimal and qualified claim, but as we will soon see, I think it still does have potentially surprising implications for ethics and policy, because we, of course, share the world with millions of species and quintillions of individuals of invertebrates like insects. And that does raise complicated questions about what it will take to consider our impacts on them in an appropriate way, given that we are interacting already with quadrillions of them per year in the wild and trillions per year in captivity. Whether we like it or not, we are interacting with a very large number of these individuals already, and those numbers might go up in the future. And so that does raise challenging questions about what it will take to give them the appropriate amount of consideration and the right kind of respectful, compassionate treatment. So what I want to do in our time together today is simply survey some of the questions that will arise and point to what I think a good initial set of thoughts are about those questions. But I want to emphasize, first of all, that this is only a survey. I am not going to be able to settle any of the issues that come up today. And emphasize, second of all, that even in that survey, as qualified as it will be, I am only going to be speaking for myself and not on behalf of the Declaration or any of the other authors or signatories of the Declaration. So what follows is simply me speaking for myself about what I take to be an increasingly important emerging field in applied ethics, insect ethics. Okay, so here are a few questions that I think come up once we acknowledge that insects have a realistic chance of being conscious, and therefore we should consider welfare risks for them when deciding how to treat them. One question is, how much do they matter individually? Another question is, how much do they matter collectively? And then a third question is, what follows for our moral priorities and for our actions and policies? And so I can briefly speak to each of those three general topics, and then we can have a conversation and see what questions you may have, or again, what objections you may have, and so on. So first of all, how much might insects matter individually? Obviously, it goes without saying, especially for experts in this group, that when I speak of insects, I am painting with a very broad brush because there are many different kinds of insects, and they differ dramatically in terms of everything from their neuron counts to their lifespans to their behavioral features and so on and so forth. So we should not reduce all insects to some, abstract general type of animal. But I will be speaking in a sufficiently abstract and general way that what I say can apply more or less to all insect species, though we should always note that caveat. So how much do they matter individually? Well, many people, not all people, many people have a strong intuition that larger and more complex and more long-lived beings matter more than smaller, simpler, more short-lived beings. And not everybody agrees with that, but I can say a little bit about why some people think that. So in general, I think many of us have the intuition, at least I have the intuition, that more suffering is worse than less suffering, and that more happiness is better than less happiness. And so, for example, if you have to decide between treating someone who has a migraine versus treating someone who has a little tiny headache, all else being equal, you should treat someone who has the migraine instead of the person who has the little tiny headache, because that would relieve more suffering. Right? And similarly, if you have to choose between treating someone who has a migraine that will last for like 5 years versus treating someone who has a migraine that will last for 5 minutes, then all else being equal, you should treat the person who has the migraine that will last for 5 years, again, because that would relieve more suffering. So I think many of us have the intuition that more suffering is worse, more happiness is better. And so if you gotta make a priority setting decision between helping someone out who has more suffering, either more intense suffering or more prolonged suffering, than someone who has less, either less intense or less prolonged, then again, you should go for the greater amount of suffering. Now, a lot of people also think that when an animal has a more complex brain, then they might be capable of more intense happiness and suffering and other welfare states at any given time. I have so many more neurons than, for example, an ant does. So yes, we might both be capable of experiencing some kind or some amount of happiness and suffering, but maybe plausibly, because of all those extra neurons I have, my happiness and suffering can be more intense. I can have higher highs and lower lows. And similarly, I have a much longer lifespan than an ant does. And so not only can I experience more happiness and suffering at any given time, perhaps, but I can also experience more happiness and suffering over time. And for those reasons, you might think, if a house is burning down and you can either save me or an ant, but not both, then even if you were being completely impartial and anti-speciesist, maybe you would still be warranted in saving me instead of the ant, because my more complex brain and my longer lifespan means that I am at greater risk of experiencing more intense suffering in the fire and at greater risk of being deprived of larger amounts of happiness in the future over the course of the rest of my life if I die, right? So even if you were completely species neutral, not giving me any extra points simply because we happen to be members of the same species, even if you were being completely species neutral, perhaps you would be warranted in saving me instead of the ant because of my apparent capacity for more intense and prolonged welfare states. And that can pretty decisively break the tie in my favor. Now, I want to emphasize not everybody accepts that picture. Some people think that we actually have equal welfare capacities across species, despite the differences in our brain complexity and the differences in our lifespans. But for the sake of this conversation, we can assume that humans do have higher welfare capacities than ants do, for example. And to that extent, we merit priority over ants. Again, when a house is burning down, you can save either me or an ant. All else being equal, you can be warranted in saving me instead of the ant because you would be preventing more suffering in the moment and allowing for more happiness in the future. Okay, so far so good. So far we have discussed this issue in a way that acknowledges the moral considerability of insects, but still preserves our place at the center of the moral circle. It still gives us the right and maybe even the responsibility to prioritize ourselves over insects, even if we were being anti-speciesist, species egalitarian. However, the story gets more complicated once we consider the difference in population sizes. So we have to ask how much insects matter, not only individually, but also collectively, and how much humans matter relative to insects, not only individually, but also collectively. And this is where matters get much more complicated because, again, we have the intuition that all else being equal, more happiness is better than less happiness, and more suffering is worse than less suffering. And many people think, and again, I agree with this, that can be true even when the happiness and suffering are experienced by different people. So for example, if you had to choose between treating a billion people who have migraines versus treating one person who has a migraine, those are your options. You can either cure a billion migraines over here or one migraine over here. Then I think you should treat a billion migraines because a billion migraines is worse than one migraine, arguably a billion times worse than one migraine. And if with the same resources you could prevent a billion migraines or cure a billion as opposed to preventing one or curing one, then you should do that. I think many of us would have that intuition. Now, it gets more complicated when you treat large numbers of small harms versus treating small numbers of large harms. So suppose that instead of it being a billion migraines versus one migraine, suppose it was a billion normal headaches versus one migraine. That is a little bit more confusing and more complicated because that one migraine is worse than any particular headache over here. But plausibly, when you add up those billion headaches, they are definitely worse than a single migraine, right? So this is a comparison between a large number of small harms and a small number of large harms, where the large one is worse than any individual small one. But when you add up all the small ones, they are definitely worse together than the large one. And that is really tough. If you had to make a decision with scarce resources about whether to cure a billion headaches versus one migraine, you might wonder whether you should go for the single worst thing or the things that are worse in the aggregate. But at least the way we do health policy and environmental policy and lots of other policies, we do aggregate harms and we try to spend scarce resources in a way that will prevent the most harm overall. Now, if you do take that approach in this situation, then it does raise the question whether, even if, say, human has a capacity for much more happiness and suffering than an ant, there might be some number of ants who can have more happiness and suffering in the aggregate than a single human, right? So I might be able to experience a million times more happiness and suffering than a single ant, right? And so maybe I matter a million times more than a single ant. But of course, there are about 8 billion humans on the planet, and then there are what, quadrillions of ants alive at any given time, and potentially quintillions of insects more generally alive at any given time. So even if the average human matters a million times more than the average insect, if there are 8 billion of us and quintillions of them, then it at least raises the question whether they might matter more than we do in the aggregate. So in other words, in the same kind of way that we have to ask how to compare a large number of small harms with a small number of large harms, we also have to ask how to compare a large number of small animals like ants with a small number of large animals like humans. And even if, as with the migraines and the headaches, any given human matters way more than any given ant, it could still be the case that if there are a sufficient number of them, the sum total of ants can still matter more from an impartial perspective than the sum total of humans. Now, that is a maybe distressing possibility to contemplate when we think about ethics. So since we will not be able to get to the bottom of it here today, I will simply make a few observations about this problem. The first is that the mere fact that a possibility is initially aversive or unintuitive is not, in my view, a sufficient reason to reject it. And one reason for that is that we have a long history of, as humans, of having bias and ignorance about each other and especially about other animals. And we have all kinds of biases against insects that might be kicking in when we have an aversive or negative reaction to the idea that they might matter more than we do in the aggregate. And one source of bias is the simple reality that we have a bias in favor of individuals who look and act like us, and that means larger animals instead of smaller animals, animals with furry skin instead of scaly skin, with 2 eyes and big eyes instead of many eyes or smaller eyes, with 4 limbs instead of a larger number of limbs, and so on and so forth. We also have scope insensitivity, and that basically means that we are not able to vividly imagine the importance of large numbers. We emotionally experience 10 deaths as about as bad as 100 deaths, or 100 deaths as about as bad as 100,000 deaths. So we have all kinds of bias and ignorance and scope and sensitivity. And then we, of course, also have individual and group self-interest. We recognize that sometimes our interests might collide with those of insects or other animals. And we worry that if we attribute to them the amount of moral weight that they truly deserve, then that would lead to a kind of deprioritization of humans, and it would lead us to sacrifice our own interests for the sake of these other animals. And that idea is aversive. And so out of a kind of self-interest or self-protection, we might try to downplay how much moral significance they might have, both individually and collectively. So I think we need to be aware of these potential sources of bias and ignorance that might be shaping our moral intuitions. And then another observation about this topic is that it might be that no view about ethics and population ethics is going to preserve our centrality in all cases. For example, even if you insist that one human matters more than an infinitely large number of ants or insects, well, then maybe that raises the possibility that a single super complex being can matter more than the full population of humans. Like if, African elephants have 3 times the number of neurons as we do. Immortal jellyfishes have potentially indefinite lifespans. We might one day encounter extraterrestrials or build sophisticated artificial intelligence systems with much more complex brains and longer lifespans. So if we insist that a small number of humans matters more than a large number of insects, then we might be setting ourselves up for the prospect that a small number of these even more complex beings matters more than 8 billion humans. So we could find our moral priority, our moral centrality challenged from both directions, because we might in the future share a world not only with much larger numbers of smaller beings, but also with smaller numbers of much larger beings. And we might find that in either or both directions, these beings have a claim to a lot of moral attention and consideration too. So again, I have not tried to solve this problem. I feel confused about it. I would suggest that we should all feel confused about it. The main point that I would like to make at present is simply that we should not, as a kind of knee-jerk instinctive response, insist or assume that humans always and necessarily matter more individually and collectively than non-human populations, including insect populations. I think that we need to pause, take a breath, consider our position in this conversation, consider our various sources of bias and ignorance, consider the upsides and downsides of all of the possible views we might accept about that topic, and then move forward from there. And so what I want to do now is close with my last 10 minutes or so of the talk and say a little bit about how then I think about moral priority setting in a multi-species community that includes everything from humans all the way to bees and fruit flies and other beings who might matter. And again, none of this is going to be conclusive, but it can give you a sense of how I think we can move forward in a kind of balanced, thoughtful, and cautious and humble way, given all of these really difficult scientific and philosophical issues. And again, this is me speaking only for myself and not for anybody else. So first of all, I think a lot of people reasonably, when setting priorities, are not doing so from a fully theoretical and impartial perspective. They are also doing so from a practical and relational, partial perspective, like really trying to figure out how they should behave in their own lives, given everything they know about themselves and their predicaments. And I think that is absolutely appropriate. And once we bring those factors into the conversation, we realize that we might have further reasons to prioritize humans over insects, especially in the short term. So consider an analogy with families. Even though my family is very small compared to the rest of the human population, I am still justified in prioritizing my family over the rest of the human population in many respects, right? And that is largely for relational and practical reasons. I have these special relationships of care and interdependence with my family members, and I have special duties of care to them. I owe them certain forms of support because of our special relationships. I also have all sorts of knowledge and capacity for helping and supporting my family that might not extend to other humans, right? Like, not only do I have special responsibilities to care for them, but I have the ability to care for them because they live right here in this apartment with me, and I know what they want and need, and I know how to provide that for them. And because there are a small enough number of them, I have the ability to provide it for them. I can give them food and water and shelter and affection on a daily basis because of those relational and practical circumstances. I know them, I care about them, they live right here, there's a small enough number of them. And none of that extends to the rest of the human population. And so I both can and should achieve and sustain higher levels of care and support for my family members than for the rest of the human population. Not because they objectively matter more, they of course objectively matter much less, but rather because they matter a lot, and I have this particular relationship with them and these particular knowledge and capacity and so on to help them. And I think that can justify me prioritizing my family over other families to some extent and in some respects. And one might think similar considerations can extend all the way to the human species in comparison with other species, right? We can have special responsibilities to provide care and support for our fellow humans that we do not have, or more than we have to other animals, both because we have at least some special relationships of care and interdependence as humans, but also because we know more about how to care for each other. And since there are fewer of us than there are other animals, we have the capacity to achieve and sustain higher levels of care and support for our fellow humans than for other animals. And there is one other consideration here too, which is that we need self-care and community care in order to be able to sustain care for others in the long run. Like, I need to take care of myself in order to be able to take care of others sustainably. And likewise, we need to collectively take care of ourselves in order to be able to take care of other animals sustainably. And so for all of those reasons, in the same way that even if my family objectively matters much less than other families in the aggregate, I can still prioritize my family in various ways. In that same way, even if humans objectively matter much less than other animals in the aggregate, we can still justify prioritizing fellow humans in some ways. But now what I want to suggest by way of closing is a couple of caveats to that argument. One is that the mere fact that I can prioritize my family over other families to some extent and in some respects, that does not mean that anything goes in my interaction with other families, right? It does not mean, for example, that I have a right, much less a responsibility, to kill your family so that I can feed their flesh to my family, simply because my family prefers the taste of human flesh over rice and beans, right? The mere fact that my family has that preference, if they did, is not reason enough for me to kill your family. I should instead go ahead and feed my family rice and beans and leave your family alone, right? And similarly, if there was a situation where I had to choose between saving my family versus saving a million other families, maybe there is a point where the stakes are high enough that I actually should make that hard choice and that sacrifice and save the million families instead of my one family. So yes, I can prioritize my family in general, but there are limits. It does not mean that I have the right to exploit or exterminate other families unnecessarily for no good reason, right? And it also does not mean that my family always and necessarily takes priority over all other families combined. So there are limits. And I think those limits might extend across species lines too. The fact that we can prioritize humanity generally for these relational and practical reasons, and because of the value of individual and collective self-care, the mere fact that we can prioritize humanity in general does not mean that we have a right to exploit and exterminate non-human animals, including insects, unnecessarily and for no good reason. Nor does it mean that we always and necessarily take priority over them. If I had to choose between, scratching a little itch that I have versus saving a billion ants from experiencing the worst possible ant suffering, maybe that ant suffering is enough to take priority over the relief of my little itch, right? And there might be other situations like that too. So what I am suggesting right now is a kind of balanced picture about moral priorities, that when the dust settles, what we might learn is that insects, as well as other non-human species, that they matter more than we do in the aggregate. Oh, wow. I think thanks to the fireworks for going off during this big conclusion. Okay. They matter more than we do in the aggregate, because they have the capacity for much more happiness and suffering than we do in the aggregate. But that nevertheless, we can prioritize ourselves over them to some extent and in some respects, especially in the short term, because of our special relationships with our fellow humans, and because of these other practical factors, like we have an ability to achieve and sustain higher levels of care and support for each other than we do for them. And we need to take care of each other in order to be able to collectively take care of them. But that there are limits to what that will justify. It does not justify unnecessary exploitation and extermination, nor does it justify prioritizing the relief of even like a tiny human itch over the relief of lots of non-human suffering. And now I will close by making one final suggestion, that as we make progress as a species, we might find that our responsibilities to care for other species, including insects, increase accordingly, right? Like humanity right now is kind of like a teenager. A teenager, maybe their main job is their own education and development. Like go to school, get an education, turn into an adult who can be a responsible citizen in the global community. And then at that point, once you are that adult making a lot of money and interacting with a lot of people, then you have a responsibility to use that money and use those powers to help others. I think humanity is similar. We right now still have very limited knowledge, very limited power, very limited political will. So there just are profound limits to what we can do for other animals, including insects. But that means that our job right now is to invest in our education and invest in our development so that we can grow into a mature version of humanity that maybe will have more resources and more capacity to care for others. And then if we do that well, and we do become that version of this species, then we will have more of a responsibility in the future to care for other animals, including insects. And I think that would be a wonderful outcome. It would be a fantastic outcome for our species if we managed to reach the point in our development as a species where we had that knowledge and we had that capacity and we had that political will, where we were able to achieve and sustain much higher levels of care and support for other animals, including millions of species and quintillions of individuals of insects. It might mean that we have more of a responsibility to care for them at that point than we do right now, but that would only be a reflection of the fact that we can care for them more at that point while still caring for ourselves. And I think that would be a fantastic victory. So right now, what are the implications of the moral considerability of insects? Well, the implications are simply that we should extend consideration to them. Everything else is going to have to be very incremental and gradual and compatible with making sure we take care of ourselves and other animals too. So I am not suggesting that we very significantly sacrifice the interests of humans and other vertebrates and, cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. I am not suggesting that we very significantly sacrifice our interests for the sake of insects right now. But I am suggesting that, for example, we think twice before we scale up insect farming as a sustainable alternative to traditional animal agriculture, that we invest in potentially less painful insecticides for when we do need to use them, and that we use them as a last resort instead of as a first resort. And that in general, we just try to invest in building knowledge and capacity and political will towards gradually more respectful and compassionate interactions with insects over time, and that we allow ourselves to learn, discover from year to year, from decade to decade, what that might mean in practice, really trying to reach for better treatment of them, but also taking seriously our limitations and our need to care for ourselves and other animals. So again, that is just me gesturing in the direction of the kind of balanced, cautious, humble, incrementalist view that I think might make sense. But I'll close again by reminding you that you can disagree with me about all of those particulars while still agreeing with me about two things. First, that there is now a realistic possibility. Yes, thank you, thumbs up too. There is now a realistic possibility that insects are conscious given the evidence available. And second, since there is a realistic possibility that insects are conscious, we should at least give minimal consideration to welfare risks for insects when making decisions about how to treat them. And then we can disagree about the details, about the probabilities, about what follows for our treatment of them. But if you think there's a realistic chance that they have consciousness and that is enough for at least minimal considerability, then you should consider signing the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, because that is all that document says. It says none of the other things that I said in this talk. And again, you can find that document at nydeclaration.com. That's nydeclaration.com. Thank you for listening to the talk. Looking forward to hearing your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff. That was, I think, well, one, a brilliant talk, and two, definitely the first one we've had with no slides, which, as someone from life sciences, is like very weird. But I gather this is not so abnormal for your field. We do have some questions, so if you're ready, we'll dive straight in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so it's quite wordy. So So good job, good job who wrote these. The UK government recognised decapod crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks as sentient, which I understand as meaning having internal subjective experience in law in 2021 on the basis of a report by Jonathan Birch, also a leading signatory of the New York Declaration. I wonder about the state of these arguments in different polities. Is a realistic possibility of consciousness versus legal recognition of sentience a disagreement about evidence, or is this a reflection of different political realities?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I would love to hear Jonathan's answer. Yes, the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness was led by me, along with Kristen Andrews from York University and Jonathan Birch from the London School of Economics. And Jonathan has also done really, really important work developing rubrics that governments can use in order to extend not only moral, but also legal and political consideration beyond vertebrates to invertebrates like cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. Now, when we use the label realistic possibility of consciousness, that does have a particular legal meaning, and I believe the legal meaning is roughly at least a 40% chance of the relevant phenomenon. So we are not right now talking about like a 1 in 10,000 chance of consciousness. We are talking about a more substantial chance of consciousness. And I think, though I could be wrong, that the work that Jonathan and others have done to extend not only moral but also legal and political consideration to cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans is not based on certainty of consciousness or sentience, but rather is based on a realistic possibility of consciousness or sentience, because we are fundamentally in this predicament with all invertebrates. We are not in a position to be certain about their internal subjective qualitative states. We can only nudge the probabilities up or down based on the evidence available to us. So I think that Jonathan and his team has developed, and that at least some governments have now accepted, a framework for extending consideration to invertebrates that now can extend to insects, given increasingly wide agreement that they have a realistic chance of being conscious too. So I think that what has now happened in the UK can and should actually extend quite naturally to this new taxon.
Okay, next question. We have someone says, thanks, Jeff. Right now, I'm at the Science of Consciousness conference, and there's a lot of discussion here of various assays and metrics by which to assess consciousness. I'm sure those assays aren't as reliable or well established yet for insects as they are for humans, but can you envision an initiative to say specifically if insect species X passes tests A, B, and C, then this particular policy or behavior should be changed in this way? Could we create such a playbook and then systematically perform these assays and have a priori a list of the implications or actions that the result should trigger and get sign-on in advance from the stakeholders that would need to enact those? I mean, as an entomologist, I'm going to say that sounds like a very difficult thing to enforce.
Right. Yeah, so I think the answer is somewhere in the middle, not quite yes and not quite no. So again, I think we are not in the position to be certain about these issues. And it would be a mistake to aspire not only to certainty, but also to very precise and reliable probabilities and utilities and so on and so forth. I do not think we can develop a rubric right now that allows us to say that this animal has a 65% chance of being conscious, and that if they are conscious, they can experience 1/1,000,000th of the amount of happiness as us. I do not think that kind of precision or reliability is available at present. However, I do think that we can develop rubrics, and people like Jonathan Birch are developing rubrics that can allow us to reduce our uncertainty and make our estimates more precise and more reliable than they presently are, as well as precise and reliable enough to be action guiding today for policymakers. That I do think is achievable. And the way that we would do that is by canvassing leading scientific theories of consciousness and sentience and agency, and finding where they interact and overlap, and what kinds of behavioral and anatomical or physiological indicators of consciousness and sentience and agency they can agree about. We might find, for example, that a fairly wide range of leading theories of consciousness and sentience and agency, that they agree that if you can perform motivational trade-offs between your desire to avoid pain versus your desire to avoid bright lights, or if you have certain forms of self-awareness or social awareness, that these are at least indicators that drive up the probability of consciousness. So that we can do, and that people are doing. And I'm excited to see people continue to invest in that sort of methodology.
Yeah, I was going to say, if anyone who's interested is listening, you should look up Matilda Gibbons' paper from, I think, 2022 in Advances in Insect Physiology, maybe. I think it's called Do Insects Feel Pain? That's a pretty excellent review. So kind of trying to do this exact thing where there are sort of behavioral and neurophysiological markers we can look at and see, make an assessment of the likelihood of, say, consciousness or sentience in this instance of insects. Jeff, what are your views on killing insects? Have you given any thought to how various different views on the ethics of killing might apply to insects, particularly given ideas around metamorphosis and how that may impact their connectedness and their continuity over their lives?
Yeah. Oh, that last part of the question is an interesting curveball. So
I wasn't expecting that either. So have fun.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. Well, I'll try to be brief, but whoever wrote that question, just know that is a great question, and it requires more care than I can give it in a brief answer. But so a couple of things. First of all, I do think that when someone is at least potentially morally significant, then we should take killing them unnecessarily to be bad and wrong. And I think that does come from numerous moral perspectives, including kind of utilitarian consequentialist moral perspectives that say ethics is about promoting happiness and reducing suffering, as well as from more like rights oriented moral perspectives that say ethics is about, live and let live. I live my life and avoid interfering with your life. Different ethical perspectives can all converge on the idea that killing someone unnecessarily is wrong, both because it might cause pain in the moment, and because it might deprive them of happiness in the future, and because it might violate their rights or interfere with their autonomy. For some combination of those reasons, I think killing is, all else being equal, bad and wrong. Now, does that mean that we should never kill insects? No, of course not. Even with humans have a right to life, of course, quite strong right to life, but I can still kill a human if I really have to, in self-defense or in other defense, or, as an unavoidable side effect of a morally important activity. There are various reasons why, even with humans who have a right to life, I might, under some circumstances, be warranted in killing them. And that will certainly carry over to insects. So not only might they have a weaker right to life than humans do, but there will be all kinds of situations where I might need to kill them in self-defense, or to defend somebody else, or because I have no choice but to apply insecticides to crops because we ultimately do need to eat something. So there will be all kinds of reasons why we do have to continue to kill insects sometimes. But I do think that we should kill them, as I said before, as a last resort instead of as a first resort, and in less painful ways rather than in more painful ways. So when I encounter a lone insect in my apartment, as a general practice, I bring them outside instead of killing them for the convenience of it. And I do that partly for that individual insect, and partly as a way of training my brain to give more respect and compassion to these individuals. And I think that we should carry that over into our interactions with insects in the aggregate too. Do we need to kill them sometimes? Yeah, we do. Should we kill them less? Yeah, we probably should. Should we invest in killing them in less painful ways? Yeah, we probably should. Now, really, really quickly, the question about continuity over time is real interesting. That relates to a philosophical debate about the badness of death, where you might think killing me is worse if I have strong psychological continuity with my future selves, because then it disrupts that continuity. Whereas if I lack strong continuity with my future selves and I just become like a new person moment to moment to moment, then killing me is less bad because it disrupts less of that continuity. I'm not going to get into that now. All I'm going to say is that's an interesting little wrinkle, and good question.
Also, just quickly add here a note about insect biology and metamorphosis that I think is interesting in this point about continuity over time. I think we tend to think of the insects that undergo complete metamorphosis, which is starting out as a larva, kind of turning into a gooey sac as a pupa, and then turning back into some radically different morphologically adults, so like a caterpillar into a butterfly, as being a complete loss of continuity. But there is research that shows that actually memories that are made in the fifth instar for some butterflies are still retained into their adult life stage. So not in every insect does every kind of memory actually get lost during the pupal stage. And so we need to be very careful if we were going to view this as a potential moment for loss of continuity of self, to actually assess whether or not it is genuinely a loss of continuity of the animal's self.
That's awesome. I did not know that, and thank you for saying it. And in general, I think this is a good reminder that we really do need to be vigilant about human bias and ignorance here. I mean, forget about insects. For other primates and other mammals and other vertebrates, for the past 50 years, even philosophers who believe that they have moral standing, moral significance, just sort of assumed this simple binary where humans are these complex agents with like plans and projects and relationships, and then other animals are just these like passive receptacles of pleasure and pain experience with no agency of their own. And of course, we now are realizing that that is a really like simplistic and reductive and convenient for humanity binary. And I think we should just be prepared for the reality that the same thing is going to happen all over again once we start to think about insects' moral significance.
All right, I think we got time for one more question, and then we will wrap this up. Jeff, you speak about the relative moral value of humans compared to something like ants. Again, I think this is going to be a bit of a big question. So yeah, again, good luck with the 5 minutes. But how do we determine the relative moral worth of beings besides intuition?
Yeah, great question. So that raises a question about what are called interspecies welfare comparisons and interspecies moral weight comparisons. And that is an empirical question and a moral question, respectively, though those questions are linked. So the empirical version, called interspecies welfare comparisons, concerns how can I compare my capacity for happiness and suffering with like a dog's and then with an ant's, both individually and then again collectively at the population level. And people are really starting to work on that right now. You might sort of naively initially assume that it can be a simple function of like cognitive complexity and longevity, you know, like maybe my neuron counts and my lifespan. But then for all kinds of reasons, that immediately gets complicated. For one thing, our capacity for welfare experience is probably not going to scale in a linear way with our neuron counts. Not all of our neurons are related to welfare experience. And it might be that the more we get, there can be these non-linear relationships that emerge. So for all kinds of reasons, even if I have 1,000,000 times more neurons than an ant, that does not automatically mean that I can experience 1,000,000 times more intense happiness or suffering at any given time. Similarly, with lifespans, you might think that if I can live 10 times as long or 20 or 40 times as long as a particular animal, like an ant, that I can experience 10 or 20 or 40 times as much happiness or suffering over the course of my life. But what if I experience the passage of time differently? Like, what if my brain has a different cognitive clock speed? And so I experience time slower or faster in a way that alters the amount of subjective experience I can have. So we have to wrestle with all those questions. And this is part of what I meant before when I said we are not going to be able to arrive at precise and reliable estimates right now, because those questions are just too hard. And there are too many unknowns at present. And we should avoid being hubristic and arrogant, as we so often are. So I do think we can reduce our uncertainty and we can be precise and reliable enough to be action guiding for policy. But there are big question marks there, and we need to keep doing research on it. Now, that also extends to moral weight comparisons too, which is more of a philosophical question. Even if I do have the capacity for 1,000,000 times more happiness than an ant, does that mean that I matter 1,000,000 times more? Some people say yes. Other people say no, that we all matter equally, even if some of us have higher capacities for welfare than others. So again, there are big question marks there. Now, I'm not trying to overwhelm you with complexity during the final couple of minutes of this talk, but I am trying to like offer a reminder that we should be cautious and humble here. So like the message maybe that I'll leave everybody with at the close of the hour, and this is both the sort of theme of my last book and my upcoming book about this topic, is that in general, we should try to guide ourselves by combining an appreciation of the importance of this issue with an appreciation of the difficulty of this issue. That can be hard to do because once you recognize that like our interactions with insects are morally important, it can be convenient to downplay the difficulty because we want to be able to take action in a confident way. And then likewise, when we really appreciate how difficult it is, it can be easy and tempting to downplay the importance. Because when something is hard, we want to be justified in not doing it. But that is just not what is happening here. This is an issue that is important because we are interacting with quadrillions of insects a year right now. They have a realistic chance of being conscious, and our interactions with them may well be harming them. So very important, but also very difficult because of all these empirical and moral unknowns. So I think we just need to proceed one step at a time, cautiously and humbly, but we do need to be taking action because this stuff matters right now and not just in 50 years once the science is better and the ethics are better. So I'll leave you with that. But obviously, like I said before, this just scratches the surface. These are ultimately going to be much deeper and broader questions. And I'm really hoping there can be a lot of field building, both in science and in ethics and in policy and across those areas so that we can be tackling these issues in a thoughtful way. So thanks everybody for listening.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jeff. Really appreciate you speaking. Very quickly off the back of that last question, I will direct people to look at Bob Fisher's Moral Weight Project, which I think is trying to do the exact thing, trying to make these sort of relative moral and welfare assessments. Because yeah, I think it's actually
exactly
very
yeah,
tricky.
That's it. Rethink priorities. The Moral Weight Project. Bob Fisher led that team at the organization Rethink Priorities, which does fantastic work.
Yeah, so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention and for attending. We will be back, I think not next month, but in June, where we'll be joined by Andrew Barron, who I think is going to talk to us about how honeybees think. So I suspect some slightly more empirical stuff there for those of you who are that way inclined. Anyway, thank you again, Jeff, and we'll see you all very soon.
All right, thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Jeff.